Sarah Mitchell stood in the pristine marble lobby of the Grand Coronado Hotel, watching her daughter Jessica emerge from the bridal suite in a cloud of ivory silk and bitter disappointment. At 42, Sarah had weathered storms across 3 oceans during her 15 years in the Navy, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight of her daughter's words that still echoed in her ears from 30 minutes earlier. "I've decided Dad should walk me down the aisle instead. Victoria thinks it would be more appropriate." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria, the stepmother who had slithered into their lives 8 years ago with her designer handbags and her family's old money arrogance. The woman who had systematically erased Sarah from every milestone in Jessica's life, one polite manipulation at a time. But today, on Jessica's wedding day, Sarah carried something more powerful than hurt feelings tucked inside her navy blazer pocket. A manila envelope containing documents that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of the Thornton family empire. Documents that Captain Marcus Rodriguez, Jessica's groom and Sarah's former shipmate, had helped her obtain through channels that the privileged Thorntons never knew existed. They had no idea that the simple military mom they had spent years diminishing had once held top-secret clearance and had friends in very interesting places. As Sarah watched the wedding party bustling around the opulent lobby, she knew that in less than 2 hours, when that envelope came out during the reception, the Thorntons would learn exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who once commanded respect on the bridge of a destroyer. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel's bridal preparation suite as Sarah knocked gently on the door she had been eagerly anticipating entering. She had driven down from her modest Point Loma apartment at dawn, her heart full of anticipation for this moment she had dreamed about since Jessica was a little girl playing dress-up in Sarah's old Navy uniforms. In her hands, she carried a small velvet box containing her grandmother's pearl earrings, the something old she had been saving for this day for 18 years. Jessica opened the door, radiant in her wedding gown, but her smile faltered the moment she saw her mother. Behind her, Victoria Thornton Mitchell swept into view like a perfectly coiffed hurricane, her ice-blue eyes immediately assessing Sarah's off-the-rack dress suit with thinly veiled disdain. Victoria had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a military campaign, and Sarah was about to become collateral damage. "Oh, Sarah, darling," Victoria purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she positioned herself protectively beside Jessica. "We were just discussing the ceremony logistics. There's been a small change of plans." The word small was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to reshaping reality to suit her preferences. Jessica's eyes darted nervously between her mother and stepmother, caught in a web of loyalty that Victoria had been weaving for years. "Jessica has decided it would be more meaningful for David to escort her down the aisle," Victoria continued, her manicured hand resting possessively on Jessica's shoulder. "After all, he has been the primary provider and has given her such stability these past years. We wouldn't want to create any awkwardness with the photographer or the guests." The dismissal was wrapped in practical concerns, but Sarah recognized it for what it truly was, the final act in Victoria's long campaign to erase her from Jessica's life. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the deck shifting beneath her feet, the same disorientation she had experienced during her first storm at sea 2 decades ago. But this time, there was no ship's railing to steady herself against, only the sinking realization that her own daughter was about to deliver the killing blow. Jessica's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, each word carefully rehearsed under Victoria's guidance. "Mom, I think it would be best if Dad walks me down the aisle." Victoria's right about the stability thing, and you know how important appearances are for Marcus's military career. Jessica's eyes pleaded for understanding, but Sarah could see the conflict tearing her daughter apart. This wasn't Jessica's idea. It was Victoria's masterpiece, delivered through Jessica's reluctant lips. The silence that followed felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, pregnant with the promise of devastation. Sarah looked at her daughter, this beautiful young woman she had raised through countless Navy deployments and single mother struggles, and saw 8 years of Victoria's subtle poison finally bearing its bitter fruit. The grandmother's pearls in Sarah's hand suddenly felt like stones, weighted with all the traditions and connections that Victoria had systematically severed. Sarah had endured years of Victoria's calculated slights, being seated at the back during Jessica's high school graduation while Victoria claimed the front row, watching Victoria plan Jessica's college visit trips without consulting her, seeing her daughter slowly adopt Victoria's refined tastes and subtle condescension towards Sarah's military background. But this public rejection on the most important day of Jessica's life, was the bridge too far. Victoria smiled triumphantly, mistaking Sarah's silence for surrender. She had no idea that Sarah Mitchell was not the type of woman who surrendered easily. 15 years of military service had taught her the value of strategic patience, of gathering intelligence before engaging the enemy. Victoria thought she had won, but she had merely revealed her position to someone who had spent her career outmaneuvering opponents far more dangerous than a privileged socialite with daddy issues. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "Whatever makes you happy." She kissed Jessica's forehead, noting how her daughter's shoulders sagged with relief and guilt in equal measure. As Sarah turned to leave the bridal suite, she caught sight of herself in the ornate mirror by the door. The woman looking back at her was no longer the hopeful mother who had entered with grandmother's pearls. This was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had stared down hostile waters and emerged victorious. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft whisper, and Sarah allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of private grief before her training kicked in. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in months, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, Jessica's groom and her former shipmate from their deployment in the Persian Gulf. Marcus had served under her command during a particularly harrowing mission, and she had saved his career when a superior officer tried to scapegoat him for a navigation error that wasn't his fault. "Marcus," she said when he answered, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded a crew of 300 sailors. "We need to talk before the ceremony. Meet me in the hotel bar in 10 minutes. It's time you learned some things about your new family that they've been keeping from you." She could hear the surprise in his voice but also the immediate respect. Marcus Rodriguez knew better than to question Sarah Mitchell when she used that tone. As Sarah walked through the hotel lobby toward the bar, her mind was already working through the intelligence she had been quietly gathering for months. The Thornton family's carefully cultivated image of respectability was built on foundations far more fragile than they realized. Richard Thornton's real estate empire included several properties with suspicious ownership structures. Eleanor Thornton's charity work involved funds that didn't always reach their intended destinations. And Victoria's first marriage had ended under circumstances that would fascinate the society pages if they ever came to light. Sarah had learned patience during her years at sea, waiting for the right wind and Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story, right moment to make her move. Today, surrounded by 500 guests including several high-ranking military officials and prominent San Diego business leaders, with photographers capturing every moment for posterity, Victoria Thornton had finally given Sarah the perfect storm she had been waiting for. The manila envelope in her blazer contained enough truth to sink the Thornton family's reputation deeper than any submarine Sarah had ever tracked. The hotel bar was quiet in the mid-morning lull, with only a few early guests nursing coffee and mimosas. Sarah ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table where she could see the lobby but remain relatively private. When Marcus appeared 5 minutes later, still adjusting his dress uniform, she could see the young lieutenant she had mentored written across his face beneath the mature features of a Navy captain. "Ma'am," he said, using her old rank out of habit as he sat across from her. "Is everything all right? You sounded serious on the phone." Marcus had grown into his authority well, but Sarah could still see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was about to marry into what he believed was a respectable family, and he trusted Sarah enough to be concerned when she called an emergency meeting on his wedding day. Sarah slid the manila envelope across the table, watching Marcus's expression change as he recognized the official seals and classification stamps that marked some of the documents inside. Marcus, you're about to become part of a family that has spent 8 years trying to convince my daughter that I'm not worthy of respect because I chose service over social status. They've systematically excluded me from Jessica's life, convinced her that my military background is somehow shameful, and today they succeeded in having me banned from walking her down the aisle. She paused, letting the weight of that betrayal settle between them. But what they don't know is that during my last deployment, I worked closely with naval intelligence on several investigations into defense contractor fraud. The Thornton family's business dealings with several military suppliers have some very interesting irregularities that certain people in Washington would find fascinating. Marcus opened the envelope with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling classified materials. As he read, his face grew progressively more serious. The documents detailed a pattern of overcharging on government contracts, suspicious campaign contributions, and connections to suppliers who had been quietly blacklisted for quality control failures. Nothing treasonous, but enough to destroy reputations and end careers if it became public knowledge. "My God, Sarah," Marcus whispered, looking up from the papers. "Does Jessica know about any of this?" The loyalty conflict was written across his face as he realized he was caught between his respect for his former commanding officer and his love for his bride. "Jessica knows nothing," Sarah replied firmly. "This isn't about punishing her. This is about ensuring that the woman who raised her gets the respect she deserves, and that you understand exactly what kind of family you're marrying into. Victoria Thornton has spent years teaching my daughter to be ashamed of the woman who sacrificed her career to raise her. Today, I'm going to remind everyone present why that sacrifice deserves honor, not dismissal." Marcus stared at the documents spread before him, his wedding day joy slowly transforming into something harder and more dangerous. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he absorbed the implications of what Sarah had placed in front of him. These weren't just financial irregularities. They were systematic patterns of fraud that could result in federal investigations and criminal charges. The woman he was about to marry had no idea that her family's wealth was built on a foundation of deception that could collapse at any moment. "How long have you known about this?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. He was thinking like a military officer now, assessing threats and calculating responses. The jovial groom, who had been adjusting his dress uniform minutes earlier, had been replaced by the hardened captain, who had navigated hostile waters under Sarah's command. Sarah's expression remained steady, though Marcus could see the pain flickering behind her professional composure. "I've been gathering this information for 6 months, ever since Victoria convinced Jessica to exclude me from the wedding planning entirely. When my own daughter started apologizing for my quote at family dinners, I knew I needed to understand exactly who was poisoning her mind against me." The weight of betrayal in Sarah's voice hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had always respected his former commanding officer, but seeing her reduced to investigating her own family's tormentors revealed a depth of humiliation that made his chest tighten with anger. Jessica had painted her mother as somewhat embarrassing, a well-meaning woman who simply didn't understand the sophisticated world she was marrying into. The truth was far more sinister. "Victoria has spent 8 years systematically erasing me from Jessica's life," Sarah continued, her fingers tracing the edge of one particularly damning document. "She started small, suggesting that my work schedule was too unpredictable for important events. Then she began hosting family gatherings when I was deployed, creating traditions that didn't include me. By the time I retired from active duty to be more present for Jessica, Victoria had already established herself as the primary maternal figure." Marcus remembered conversations with Jessica about her family, how she would speak about Victoria with a mixture of admiration and anxiety that he had attributed to normal step-family dynamics. Now he realized that what he had interpreted as typical adjustment issues were actually the symptoms of a calculated campaign of alienation. Victoria hadn't just married David Mitchell, she had systematically conquered his daughter's affections and loyalties. "The worst part," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is that Jessica genuinely believes she's protecting my feelings by keeping me at arm's length. Victoria has convinced her that including me in sophisticated social situations would be embarrassing for everyone involved. My daughter thinks she's being kind by limiting my role in her life." The manipulation was breathtakingly thorough, Marcus realized. Victoria had managed to turn Sarah's love for her daughter into a weapon against her, using Jessica's desire to avoid hurting anyone as a mechanism for excluding the woman who had raised her. It was psychological warfare disguised as family harmony, and Jessica was both victim and unwitting accomplice. Marcus looked up from the documents to study Sarah's face, seeing for the first time the careful control she maintained over her emotions. During their deployment together, he had watched her navigate diplomatic crises and military emergencies with the same steady composure she was displaying now. But this was different. This was personal, and the stakes were higher than any mission they had faced together in the Gulf. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You didn't show me this just to inform me about my future in-laws' legal troubles." Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade, carrying echoes of the tactical brilliance that had made her one of the most respected officers in their squadron. "I want you to understand that when the Thornton family treats me like an embarrassment today, they're disrespecting not just me but every woman who has ever served this country. And I want you to remember that you owe your career, your reputation, and quite possibly your life to the woman they're teaching my daughter to be ashamed of." The reminder hit Marcus with the force of a revelation. During their deployment, Sarah had indeed saved his career when Commander Peterson had tried to blame him for a navigation error that had nearly resulted in a collision with a civilian vessel. Sarah had conducted her own investigation, uncovered evidence that Peterson had been drinking on duty, and presented her findings to the Admiral in a way that protected Marcus while exposing the real threat to ship safety. Without her intervention, Marcus would have been court-martialed and discharged in disgrace. "They have no idea who they're dealing with," Marcus said, a note of admiration creeping into his voice. "Victoria thinks she's outmaneuvered some small-town military wife, doesn't she?" "Victoria Thornton has never encountered anyone like me," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "She's spent her entire life manipulating people through social pressure and financial leverage. She's never faced someone who understands real power, the kind that comes from earning respect rather than inheriting it." Marcus began gathering the documents, his movements deliberate and careful. "What's your endgame here, Sarah? You obviously have a plan that goes beyond just showing me these papers." Sarah's expression softened slightly, revealing the mother beneath the strategic military mind. "I want my daughter to understand that the woman who raised her is worthy of respect. I want her to stop apologizing for my service record and start taking pride in it. And I want Victoria Thornton to learn that some battles shouldn't be picked." The simplicity of Sarah's goals made them all the more powerful. She wasn't seeking revenge or destruction, she was fighting for recognition and dignity. Marcus could see the careful planning behind her approach, the way she had waited for exactly the right moment, when maximum pressure could be applied with minimum collateral damage. "The reception," Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. "You're planning to do this during the reception, aren't you? When all their friends and business associates are present, when the photographers are capturing everything for posterity." Sarah nodded slowly. "Victoria has invited everyone who matters in San Diego society to witness what she believes will be my final humiliation. She has no idea that she's actually assembled the perfect audience for my vindication. When these documents become public knowledge, every person in that room will remember exactly how the Thornton family treated the veteran who uncovered their secrets." The brilliance of the strategy impressed Marcus despite the circumstances. Sarah had turned Victoria's moment of triumph into a trap, using the stepmother's own arrogance and desire for public validation against her. The wedding reception would become a theater where years of subtle humiliation would be reversed in a single devastating revelation. "There's something else," Sarah said, reaching into her blazer and extracting a second, smaller envelope. "These documents detail Victoria's first marriage, including the real reason it ended and the settlement terms that were sealed by the court. Richard Thornton's business relationship with her ex-husband's company, and how that relationship influenced several government contracts." Marcus felt a chill as he realized the full scope of what Sarah had uncovered. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was a complex web of personal and professional relationships that could implicate multiple prominent families in San Diego's elite social circle. Victoria's carefully constructed image as a respectable widow who had found love again, was built on lies that Sarah could demolish with surgical precision. "Jesus, Sarah," Marcus breathed. "You could destroy them completely with this." "I could," Sarah agreed, "but that's not what I want. I want my daughter to see that her mother is someone worth respecting, and I want Victoria to understand that respect is earned, not demanded. If they choose to escalate after that, well, they'll discover that I have additional resources at my disposal." The threat was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone who had spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Marcus realized that Sarah had given him a choice to make, one that would define not just his wedding day but potentially his entire marriage. He could align himself with his bride's family and their comfortable lives, or he could stand with the woman who had shaped him into the officer he had become. The decision, when it came to him, felt as natural as following a direct order from a superior officer he trusted completely. Marcus stood up from the table, gathering the documents with practiced efficiency. "What do you need me to do, Admiral?" The use of her nickname from their deployment days brought the first genuine smile Sarah had shown all morning. "Just be ready to follow my lead during the reception toasts. And Marcus? Make sure you're wearing your full-dress uniform with all your commendations. People need to see exactly what kind of officer respects the woman Victoria has been trying to diminish." As they prepared to leave the hotel bar, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of preparing for a mission where the stakes were higher than they appeared on the surface. This wasn't just about family drama or wedding day politics. It was about honor, respect, and the recognition of service that every veteran deserved. Sarah Mitchell had served her country with distinction, sacrificed her career for her daughter's welfare, and earned the right to walk that daughter down the aisle. If the Thornton family couldn't see that, Marcus would make sure everyone else in attendance understood exactly what they were witnessing. The story of how Victoria Thornton systematically dismantled Sarah's relationship with Jessica began 3 months after David Mitchell introduced his new girlfriend to his 10-year-old daughter. Sarah had been deployed in the Mediterranean at the time, coordinating intelligence operations for a NATO exercise, when she received David's casual email announcing that Jessica would be spending Christmas with the family in La Jolla instead of waiting for Sarah's return in January. The email had arrived in Sarah's shipboard quarters at 0300, and she remembered staring at the glowing screen in disbelief. For 8 years, she and Jessica had maintained their Christmas tradition of decorating a small tree together and exchanging homemade gifts, no matter how late Sarah's deployment schedule ran. It was their sacred ritual, born from the necessity of military life, but strengthened by genuine love and creativity. Jessica would spend weeks crafting elaborate ornaments from construction paper and glitter, while Sarah would carve small wooden figures during her off-duty hours in the ship's workshop. When Sarah called David to discuss the change, she encountered the first hint of Victoria's influence seeping into their family dynamics. David's voice carried a defensive edge she hadn't heard before, coupled with phrases that sounded rehearsed and foreign coming from his mouth. He spoke about stability and consistency, and the importance of Jessica integrating with her new family structure in ways that made Sarah's chest tighten with foreboding. "Jessica needs routine, Sarah," David had said, his voice echoing strangely over the satellite connection. "Victoria has been wonderful about creating a sense of normalcy when you're away. The girl deserves to have Christmas morning in a real home, not waiting around for whenever the Navy decides to let you come back." The casual cruelty of his words had stunned Sarah into silence. A real home. As if the apartment she and Jessica had carefully decorated together, filled with photos from their adventures and mementos from Sarah's travels, was somehow insufficient compared to Victoria's inherited mansion, with its professionally decorated interiors and staff-maintained gardens. The implication that Sarah's service was a choice rather than a calling, something selfish rather than sacrificial, planted the first seed of doubt that would grow into a forest of alienation over the following years. When Sarah finally returned from deployment in February, she found subtle but significant changes in Jessica's bedroom at the apartment. The handmade quilt Sarah's mother had sewn for her granddaughter had been replaced with a designer comforter set in sophisticated neutral tones. Jessica's collection of books about female pilots and astronauts had been supplemented with volumes about etiquette and proper social behavior. Most painfully, the bulletin board where Jessica had proudly displayed postcards from Sarah's various ports of call had been taken down entirely, replaced with a mirror framed in antique silver. "Victoria thought my room looked a little childish," Jessica had explained with the earnest apologetic tone of a 10-year-old trying to spare her mother's feelings. "She helped me redecorate to be more mature. Don't you think it looks sophisticated now?" The word sophisticated became Victoria's weapon of choice in the campaign against Sarah's influence. Everything about Sarah's lifestyle was gradually reframed as unsophisticated. Her practical clothing choices, her preference for cooking at home rather than dining out, her habit of taking Jessica to free museums and public beaches instead of exclusive clubs and private resorts. Victoria never directly criticized Sarah, which would have been too obvious and potentially backfired. Instead, she offered gentle suggestions and alternative experiences that slowly shifted Jessica's perspective on what constituted appropriate behavior for a young lady of her social standing. The transformation accelerated when Jessica entered middle school and began spending more time at David's house during Sarah's shorter deployments. Victoria enrolled her in an exclusive private academy where most of the students came from generational wealth and viewed military families as curiosities at best. Jessica's new classmates had never moved from base to base, never learned to make friends quickly because deployment schedules demanded adaptability, never felt pride in a parent's service record because their parents' accomplishments were measured in stock portfolios and real estate holdings. Sarah began noticing changes in Jessica's vocabulary and interests during their phone calls. Her daughter started using phrases like appropriate social circles and expressing embarrassment about aspects of their life that had never bothered her before. When Sarah asked about Jessica's new friends, she heard stories about girls whose mothers belonged to charity boards and country clubs, whose idea of community service involved organizing fundraising galas rather than actually working with the populations they claimed to help. The most insidious part of Victoria's strategy was how she weaponized Sarah's own values against her. Sarah had always taught Jessica to be considerate of others' feelings, to think before speaking, and to avoid causing unnecessary conflict. Victoria used these lessons to convince Jessica that including Sarah in certain social situations would be awkward for everyone involved, that the kindest thing to do was to gently limit her mother's exposure to environments where she might feel out of place. "Mom, you don't really want to come to the country club luncheon, do you?" Jessica would ask with genuine concern in her voice. "Victoria says some of the ladies there can be pretty snobbish about people who work for a living. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." The reverse psychology was masterful. Victoria had convinced Jessica that excluding Sarah was actually an act of protection, a way of shielding her mother from the judgment of people who wouldn't appreciate her background. Jessica genuinely believed she was being thoughtful when she suggested that Sarah might prefer to skip certain events or avoid particular social gatherings. The exclusion was reframed as consideration, the isolation presented as kindness. By the time Jessica entered high school, the pattern was so well established that it felt natural to everyone involved. Sarah would attend the academic ceremonies and athletic events that mattered to Jessica personally, but she was quietly absent from the social occasions that mattered to the Thornton family's status and reputation. Parent-teacher conferences were handled by David and Victoria, school fundraising committees were staffed by Victoria and her circle of friends, and college preparation was managed through connections and resources that Sarah couldn't access or match. The final twist of the knife came during Jessica's senior year, when she was accepted to Stanford University. Sarah had been incredibly proud, knowing that her daughter's intelligence and work ethic had earned her a place at one of the nation's most prestigious institutions. She had assumed that she would be part of the celebration, the family discussions about dormitory arrangements and course selections, the proud moment of dropping Jessica off for her freshman year. Instead, she received a phone call from Jessica explaining that Victoria had already planned a quote-quote family weekend in Palo Alto to get Jessica settled, complete with reservations at exclusive restaurants and appointments with interior designers to create the perfect dormitory environment. Sarah was welcome to visit later, of course, once Jessica had adjusted to college life, and had time to arrange something more low-key that wouldn't interfere with the sophisticated social connections Victoria was helping her establish. "You understand, don't you, Mom?" Jessica had asked, her voice carrying that familiar note of anxious apology. Victoria knows all about how these things work at schools like Stanford. She went there herself, and her mother did too. They know which traditions are important, and how to make the right impression with the other families. "I promise we'll do something special together once I'm settled in." The something special never materialized, of course. College life was busy, and Victoria's influence extended even to Jessica's academic and social choices at Stanford. Sarah found herself relegated to brief phone calls and occasional care packages, while Victoria maintained constant contact through texts, emails, and regular visits that always seemed to coincide with important events or milestones that Sarah would miss because of her work schedule or lack of advance notice. The engagement announcement had been the culmination of 8 years of systematic exclusion. Sarah learned about Jessica's relationship with Marcus through a social media post rather than a personal conversation, discovered the engagement through a formal announcement in the San Diego Union Tribune Society pages rather than a phone call from her daughter. The wedding planning process had been entirely managed by Victoria and Eleanor Thornton, with Jessica genuinely believing that her mother's practical input would be less valuable than the expertise of women who had navigated high society weddings for generations. Standing in the hotel lobby now, watching Jessica emerge from the bridal suite in the dress Victoria had selected, at the venue Victoria had chosen, preparing for a ceremony orchestrated entirely by Victoria's vision of appropriate elegance, Sarah felt the full weight of how completely she had been erased from her daughter's most important moments. The exclusion from walking Jessica down the aisle wasn't a sudden decision. It was the inevitable conclusion of a campaign that had been building momentum for nearly a decade. But Victoria Thornton had made one crucial miscalculation in her long strategy of alienation and manipulation. She had assumed that Sarah Mitchell was just another military spouse who would quietly accept marginalization for the sake of family peace. She had no idea that Sarah was a decorated intelligence officer who understood psychological warfare better than Victoria could imagine, and who had spent her career learning how to turn enemy tactics against themselves. The stepmother who thought she had won the war was about to discover that she had merely provided her opponent with the motivation and intelligence necessary to plan the perfect counterattack. The evidence of Victoria's calculated destruction of Sarah's relationship with Jessica mounted with each passing year, building into an undeniable pattern that would have impressed even the most seasoned intelligence analyst. What had begun as subtle suggestions and gentle redirections had evolved into a comprehensive campaign of emotional manipulation that left Jessica genuinely convinced she was protecting her mother from social embarrassment while simultaneously cutting her out of every meaningful moment of her young adult life. The high school graduation ceremony had been a masterclass in Victoria's particular brand of psychological warfare. Sarah had been invited, of course, because excluding her entirely would have raised questions and potentially generated sympathy for the woman Victoria was working so hard to marginalize. Instead, Victoria had orchestrated a series of seemingly innocent circumstances that effectively minimized Sarah's presence, while highlighting her own central role in Jessica's achievement. The seating arrangements placed Sarah in the general audience section, while Victoria, David, and the extended Thornton family occupied reserved seats in the front rows, designated for immediate family members. When Sarah questioned the placement, Jessica had explained with genuine distress that there simply weren't enough premium seats for everyone, and since Victoria had been so involved in Jessica's academic success, it seemed fair to prioritize her placement. The explanation was delivered with such earnest consideration for everyone's feelings that Sarah found herself nodding along with the logic, even as her heart broke at being relegated to observer status at her own daughter's milestone. The post-graduation celebration dinner had been even more carefully orchestrated. Victoria had made reservations at an exclusive restaurant that required advance booking and formal attire, naturally assuming that Sarah would prefer something more casual and accessible. When Sarah arrived in her best dress, she discovered that the table arrangements seated her between David's elderly aunt and a family friend who spoke primarily about stock portfolios and property investments, topics that effectively excluded Sarah from meaningful conversation throughout the evening. Meanwhile, Victoria held court at the other end of the table. regaling the gathering with stories about Jessica's academic achievements and college prospects, weaving herself so seamlessly into the narrative of Jessica's success that casual observers would have assumed she was the primary parental figure responsible for raising such an accomplished young woman. Sarah watched her daughter beam with pride as Victoria detailed the college application strategy they had developed together, the networking connections Victoria had provided, and the cultural experiences Victoria had arranged to broaden Jessica's worldview. The most painful moment had come when the restaurant staff brought out a congratulatory cake Victoria had pre-ordered, decorated with an inscription that read, "Congratulations, Jessica, from your proud family." Not families plural, acknowledging both Sarah's biological connection and Victoria's step-parental role, but family singular, as if there were only one unit that mattered in Jessica's life. Sarah had smiled and applauded with everyone else, but the exclusion felt like a physical blow. College move-in day had been the crescendo of Victoria's campaign to establish herself as Jessica's primary maternal figure. The weekend had been planned with military precision, involving coordinated hotel reservations for the extended Thornton family, scheduled meetings with university administrators, and carefully arranged social events designed to introduce Jessica to other prominent families whose children would be attending Stanford. Sarah had been informed about the plans 2 weeks in advance, presented with an itinerary that left no meaningful role for her participation. "Victoria has everything handled, Mom," Jessica had explained during one of their weekly phone calls, her voice bright with excitement about the upcoming adventure. "She's arranged for us to stay at this amazing hotel near campus, and she knows some families with kids in Jessica's class, so there's going to be this whole welcome weekend thing. You'd probably find it pretty boring, honestly. Lots of fancy dinner parties and networking stuff." The casual dismissal had been delivered without malice, which somehow made it more devastating than outright hostility would have been. Jessica genuinely believed that her mother would be bored by the sophisticated social events that marked her transition to adult independence. The idea that Sarah might want to be involved in choosing dormitory furnishings, meeting her daughter's roommate, or simply sharing the emotional significance of launching Jessica's college career had been erased so thoroughly that Jessica couldn't even imagine it as a possibility. When Sarah had tentatively suggested that she might drive up for a brief visit during the move-in weekend, just to help carry boxes or take some photos, Jessica had responded with the kind of anxious concern that Victoria had trained her to feel whenever her two worlds threatened to collide. "Oh, Mom, that's so sweet of you to offer, but Victoria has already hired professional movers, and there's going to be a photographer documenting everything for the family album. Plus, you'd have to get a hotel room somewhere, and everything nearby is probably booked up by now." The message was clear. Sarah's presence would be redundant at best, disruptive at worst. Victoria had anticipated every practical need and social requirement, leaving no space for Sarah's maternal instincts or emotional involvement. The woman who had raised Jessica through countless military relocations, who had taught her daughter resilience and adaptability, who had sacrificed career advancement to provide stability during the turbulent years following the divorce, was now considered unnecessary baggage in her daughter's transition to independence. The engagement announcement had followed the same pattern of exclusion disguised as consideration. Sarah had learned about Marcus through casual mentions in their increasingly infrequent phone conversations, hearing about Jessica's, quote, "friend from work," who occasionally appeared in social media photos but was never described as anything more serious than a pleasant companion. When the relationship progressed to cohabitation, Sarah discovered the development through a change in Jessica's mailing address, rather than a deliberate conversation about this significant step in her daughter's romantic life. The proposal itself had been a carefully orchestrated family affair that included both sets of grandparents, David and Victoria, and several close friends, but somehow no mention had been made to Sarah until after the engagement photos had been taken and the announcements had been sent to the society pages. Jessica had called her 3 days later, bubbling with excitement about the romantic dinner at an exclusive restaurant, the surprise appearance of family members who had flown in for the occasion, and the gorgeous ring that Marcus had designed with input from Victoria, who apparently had exquisite taste in jewelry and connections with the finest artisans in San Diego. "I wanted to call you right away, Mom, but everything was so crazy with all the family stuff, and I knew you'd want to hear all the details when I had time to really talk," Jessica had explained, her voice carrying that familiar note of apology mixed with genuine enthusiasm. "Marcus is amazing, and Victoria says he's exactly the kind of man who will be a great partner for someone in my position. She's already started making preliminary plans for the wedding, and she has the most incredible ideas." The wedding planning process had been the final demonstration of how completely Victoria had assumed the maternal role in Jessica's life. Every decision, from the venue selection to the menu planning to the guest list compilation, had been made through consultations between Jessica and Victoria, with David occasionally weighing in on financial considerations, but Sarah remaining entirely outside the decision-making process. When Sarah had asked about participating in the planning, Jessica had responded with genuine confusion about what role her mother might want to play. "Victoria has experience with these kinds of events, Mom, and she knows all the best vendors and venues in San Diego. She's been planning society weddings for years, and she has connections that can get us access to places that would normally have waiting lists. I didn't want to burden you with all the stress and logistics when Victoria is so good at handling these things." The word burden had stung more than Jessica realized. Sarah's desire to participate in planning her daughter's wedding wasn't about stress or logistics. It was about connection, tradition, and the fundamental relationship between mother and daughter that should have made such participation natural and expected. But Victoria had so thoroughly established herself as the family's event coordinator and social liaison that Jessica couldn't imagine why anyone else would want to take on responsibilities that Victoria handled with such apparent ease and expertise. The dress shopping expedition had been the most painful exclusion of all. Sarah had assumed that choosing a wedding dress would be one of those sacred mother-daughter traditions that even Victoria's influence couldn't penetrate. She had envisioned spending a day together in bridal boutiques, sharing opinions and emotions, creating memories that would last beyond the wedding itself. Instead, she had learned about the dress selection through a text message that included a photo of Jessica in a stunning gown, surrounded by Victoria, Eleanor Thornton, and several of Victoria's friends, all beaming with satisfaction at their successful shopping mission. "Isn't it perfect?" Jessica had texted. "Victoria knew exactly which boutiques would have dresses in my style, and her friends gave such great advice about what would photograph well and look appropriate for the venue." I felt like I was on one of those reality shows where they transformed the bride. The casual exclusion from this most intimate of pre-wedding rituals had been presented as a practical decision, rather than an emotional rejection. Victoria had the connections, the expertise, and the available time to make the dress shopping experience special and successful. Sarah's participation would have been redundant, potentially complicating the group dynamics and decision-making process that Victoria had streamlined through her social connections and experience. Each exclusion had been individually reasonable, collectively devastating. Victoria had never explicitly stated that Sarah was unwelcome or inadequate. She had simply made herself so indispensable and created such efficient systems for handling every aspect of Jessica's important life events that Sarah's involvement seemed unnecessary at best, potentially disruptive at worst. The cumulative effect was the complete marginalization of the woman who had raised Jessica, achieved through a campaign so subtle and well executed that even Jessica remained unaware of what had been lost in the process. The wedding ceremony unfolded with the precision of a military operation, every detail orchestrated by Victoria's meticulous planning and executed by a team of professionals who had transformed the Grand Coronado Hotel's beachfront terrace into a vision of elegant sophistication. Sarah stood among the guests in the carefully arranged seating chart that placed her in the fourth row, far enough from the altar to avoid any prominent position in the wedding photographs but close enough to appear included in the family celebration. She watched her daughter glide down the aisle on David's arm, radiant in the designer gown that Victoria had selected, moving toward a future that had been shaped by influences Sarah barely recognized. Marcus stood at the altar in his full dress uniform, every ribbon and commendation gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the elegant white fabric draped between towering palm trees. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching the young officer she had mentored stand ready to pledge his life to her daughter, but the emotion was tempered by the bitter awareness that the woman who had shaped his character and saved his career was considered unworthy of escorting the bride to meet him. The irony was so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. The ceremony proceeded with flawless execution, each element designed to reflect the sophisticated taste and social standing that Victoria had cultivated as the family's signature style. The officiant, a distinguished chaplain whom Marcus had requested from his naval service, spoke eloquently about love, commitment, and the sacred bond between two people choosing to build a life together. Sarah listened to the beautiful words while calculating the precise moment when she would transform this carefully choreographed celebration into something Victoria would never forget. When the chaplain pronounced Marcus and Jessica husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted in applause and celebration, but Sarah remained focused on the subtle signals she and Marcus had arranged during their conversation in the hotel bar. His slight nod as he kissed his new bride confirmed that he understood the plan and was prepared to follow her lead when the moment arrived. The documents in Sarah's purse felt like live ammunition, ready to be deployed with surgical precision when the target presented herself. The cocktail hour provided Sarah with the opportunity to observe Victoria in her natural element, graciously accepting congratulations from the assembled elite of San Diego society while basking in the reflected glory of having orchestrated such a magnificent event. Sarah watched her move through the crowd with practiced charm, introducing Jessica to influential business leaders and their wives, ensuring that her stepdaughter was properly connected to the social network that Victoria considered essential for a successful marriage in their circles. "Sarah, darling," Victoria approached with a champagne flute in her manicured hand and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You must be so proud of Jessica today. She looks absolutely radiant, doesn't she? I think the dress choice was perfect for her figure and the venue." The casual appropriation of credit for Jessica's appearance was delivered with such smooth confidence that anyone overhearing the conversation would assume Victoria had been intimately involved in every aspect of the bride's preparation. Sarah smiled back with equal warmth, her voice carrying none of the steel that was building beneath her composed exterior. "She's beautiful," Sarah agreed, "and I'm sure she appreciates all the guidance you've provided. You've certainly made quite an impression on everyone here today." Victoria's smile widened at what she interpreted as acknowledgement of her successful orchestration of the wedding festivities. "Well, these things require a certain level of experience and connections to execute properly. I'm just glad I could help Jessica navigate something so important. A wedding like this sets the tone for a couple's entire social standing. You know." The condescension was wrapped in helpful explanation, as if Sarah needed Victoria to illuminate the social significance of wedding celebrations. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, filing away Victoria's words for later use while maintaining the facade of grateful family harmony that Victoria expected from their interactions. "I imagine you have quite a bit of experience with these sophisticated social events," Sarah said, her tone perfectly calibrated to sound impressed rather than investigative. "Jessica has mentioned how connected you are to all the right people in San Diego." Victoria preened slightly at the compliment, unaware that she was providing Sarah with the perfect opening for what would come during the reception toasts. "Well, when you've been part of certain social circles for as long as I have, you develop relationships that can be quite valuable for family occasions like this. It's all about knowing the right people and understanding how these things should be handled." As the cocktail hour concluded and guests began moving toward the reception area, Sarah positioned herself strategically near the head table where the wedding party would be seated for dinner. She had studied the seating chart and knew exactly where Victoria would be positioned for maximum visibility and social impact. The stepmother, who had spent years maneuvering herself into the center of Jessica's life, had unknowingly arranged herself as the perfect target for Sarah's carefully planned revelation. The reception dinner proceeded with the same flawless execution that had characterized the ceremony, each course timed perfectly and presented with the kind of artistic flair that reflected Victoria's insistence on employing only the most prestigious caterers in the city. Sarah ate mechanically, her mind focused on the approaching moment when the evening's carefully scripted harmony would be shattered by truths that Victoria had never imagined could surface. When the dinner plates were cleared and the champagne glasses were filled for the traditional toasts, Sarah felt her pulse steady into the calm rhythm she had always experienced before executing a critical mission. The nervous energy that had sustained her through the ceremony and cocktail hour transformed into the focused clarity that had made her one of the Navy's most effective intelligence officers. Marcus rose first, as tradition dictated, to toast his new bride. His words were heartfelt and genuine, speaking of love, partnership, and the future they would build together. But Sarah caught the subtle emphasis he placed on certain phrases about honor, respect, and the importance of recognizing those who had shaped their character and values. He was laying the groundwork for what would follow, establishing themes that would make Sarah's intervention feel like a natural extension of the evening's tributes, rather than an unexpected attack. David's toast followed, filled with paternal pride and appreciation for the man Jessica had chosen to marry. He spoke about Marcus's distinguished service record and bright future, inadvertently highlighting the military connections that would make Sarah's subsequent revelations even more impactful. When David raised his glass to toast the beautiful families that are joining together today, Sarah felt the irony of his words like a blade between her ribs. Victoria's toast was a masterpiece of social positioning disguised as maternal sentiment. She spoke eloquently about Jessica's growth into a sophisticated young woman, her excellent choice in a partner who would support her continued development in the appropriate social circles, and the bright future that awaited a couple with such excellent connections and prospects. Every word reinforced Victoria's role as the guiding maternal influence who had shaped Jessica's success and social development. "And I want to thank everyone here tonight for being part of this celebration," Victoria concluded, her voice carrying across the reception area with practiced authority. "It takes a village to raise a remarkable young woman like Jessica, and I'm so grateful for all the people who have contributed to making her the person she is today." The applause was warm and sustained, exactly the response Victoria had cultivated through years of careful relationship building and social investment. Sarah waited for the clapping to subside, then rose gracefully from her seat, moving with the confident bearing that had once commanded respect on the bridge of a naval destroyer. "If I may," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the reception area without seeming raised or aggressive, "I'd like to add a few words to tonight's toasts." A subtle tension rippled through the gathering as guests recognized that this was not part of the planned program. Victoria's expression flickered with surprise and annoyance, but social convention prevented her from objecting to what appeared to be a spontaneous expression of maternal sentiment. "Thank you, Victoria, for those beautiful words about the village that raises a remarkable young woman," Sarah began, her tone warm and appreciative. "It's such an important reminder that children are shaped by all the influences in their lives, and that we should always acknowledge the contributions that matter most." Victoria smiled and nodded, interpreting Sarah's opening as gracious acknowledgement of her own central role in Jessica's development. The stepmother had no idea that she was about to become the target of a precision strike that would devastate her. Carefully constructed social standing. "I've been thinking about that concept of contribution quite a bit lately," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had once briefed admirals on intelligence assessments. "About how we measure what really matters in shaping young people's character and values. About the difference between superficial influence and genuine sacrifice." The reception area fell silent as guests sensed a shift in the evening's emotional temperature. Marcus straightened in his chair, his expression alert and respectful as he prepared to support the woman who had transformed his career and character. 22 years ago, I took an oath to defend this country and protect the freedoms we all enjoy," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. 15 years of that service were spent in active duty, including deployments to combat zones where Jessica's father and I both served with distinction. I earned the rank of lieutenant commander through merit, dedication, and the kind of sacrifice that people in this room benefit from, but rarely acknowledge. Victoria's face began to pale as she realized that Sarah's speech was not following the expected pattern of gracious family sentiment. The guests were listening with growing attention, drawn by the authentic emotion and unexpected revelation of military service that none of them had known about. "During my final deployment, I had the honor of serving as Captain Rodriguez's commanding officer," Sarah continued, turning slightly to acknowledge Marcus with a nod of recognition. "He was a young lieutenant then, brilliant and dedicated, but caught in a situation that could have ended his career through no fault of his own. I had the privilege of protecting his future and ensuring that his service record reflected his true character and capabilities." Marcus rose from his seat, his movement fluid and precise as he came to attention in a gesture of military respect that sent a visible shock through the assembled guests. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a subordinate addressing a respected superior officer. "Permission to speak." Granted, Captain, Sarah replied, using his current rank with the authority of someone who had watched him earn every promotion. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus said, turning to address the reception area with the commanding presence that had made him a successful naval officer. I want you to understand that you are in the presence of one of the finest officers I have ever had the honor to serve under. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell saved my career, shaped my character, and taught me the meaning of true leadership under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The impact of Marcus's declaration rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Victoria's carefully constructed narrative about sophisticated social influence crumbled in the face of authentic military respect and genuine gratitude. The guests who had been impressed by her social connections were now witnessing a display of earned honor that made her networking accomplishments seem trivial by comparison. Admiral Mom, Marcus continued, using the nickname that had been born during their deployment when his fellow officers had recognized Sarah's combination of maternal protectiveness and military authority, taught me that real leadership means protecting those under your command, even when it requires personal sacrifice. She exemplified the values that make our military strong and our country secure. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time that day, but they were tears of vindication rather than pain. After years of being marginalized and dismissed, she was finally receiving public recognition for the service and sacrifice that had defined her adult life. The title Admiral Mom resonated through the reception area, transforming her from David Mitchell's ex-wife into a decorated veteran who commanded genuine respect. Which brings me to why I wanted to speak tonight, Sarah said, her voice steady and clear as she reached into her purse and withdrew the manila envelope that contained Victoria's secrets. Because I think it's important for everyone here to understand the full picture of the influences that have shaped this beautiful celebration. Victoria's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm as she recognized the envelope and began to comprehend that Sarah's speech was not a spontaneous expression of maternal pride, but a carefully planned revelation that threatened to expose things Victoria had worked very hard to keep hidden. You see, Sarah continued, opening the envelope with deliberate precision, when someone spends years trying to convince my daughter that her mother's military service is something to be embarrassed about, when they systematically exclude the woman who raised her from every important moment in her adult life, when they teach her to apologize for the background and values that made her who she is, well, that motivates me to do a little research. The papers Sarah extracted from the envelope were clearly official documents, bearing government seals and classification markings that several of the military officers in attendance immediately recognized as authentic intelligence materials. Victoria's face went from pale to ashen as she realized that her worst nightmare was unfolding in front of everyone who mattered in her social world. These documents detail some fascinating connections between the Thornton family business interests and certain defense contractors who have been under federal investigation for fraud and overcharging on government contracts, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials on sensitive intelligence matters. Contracts that were awarded through influence and connections rather than merit, resulting in substandard equipment being provided to the brave men and women who serve our country. The revelation sent a visible shock through the gathering, particularly among the military officers and government officials who understood the implications of defense contractor fraud. Victoria's social standing, built on her family's reputation for respectability and patriotic service, crumbled as guests absorbed the reality that their wealth had been generated through schemes that endangered the very service members they claimed to support. There's more, of course, Sarah continued, extracting additional documents from the envelope. Details about charitable organizations that exist primarily to launder money and provide tax shelters for wealthy donors. About political contributions that purchased favorable treatment for family business interests. About a pattern of behavior that represents everything our military fights against. Marcus stepped forward, his expression grim as he recognized the type of corruption that he and his fellow officers encountered in their efforts to maintain military readiness and effectiveness. Ma'am, are you saying that Mrs. Thornton's family has been profiting from fraud against the Department of Defense? I'm saying, Captain, that the woman who has spent 8 years teaching my daughter to be ashamed of military service has been living very comfortably on money stolen from the military budget, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the cold fury of someone who had dedicated her life to serving her country only to watch others profit from betraying it. The reception area erupted in shocked murmurs and conversations as guests processed the magnitude of what Sarah had revealed. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed social persona disintegrating under the weight of evidence that she could neither deny nor explain away. The woman who had spent years positioning herself as the arbiter of appropriate behavior and social respectability had been exposed as a fraud whose lifestyle was built on criminal activity. "But here's what I find most interesting about tonight," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the crowd noise with renewed authority. "The woman who convinced my daughter that I wasn't sophisticated enough to walk her down the aisle, who spent years teaching her to apologize for her mother's service to this country, who systematically excluded me from every important moment in Jessica's adult life because military families don't have the right social connections. This woman has been living off money stolen from the very institution I served with honor." Jessica sat at the head table, her face a mask of shock and confusion, as she struggled to process the complete reversal of everything she had been taught about her family's respective worth and respectability. The sophisticated stepmother who had guided her social development was revealed as a criminal, while the mother she had been taught to consider somewhat embarrassing was standing before her as a decorated veteran, commanding genuine respect from everyone present. "Admiral Mom," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the reception area with military precision, "with your permission, I'd like to make one final toast." Sarah nodded, recognizing that her former subordinate understood exactly what needed to happen next to complete the evening's transformation. Marcus raised his champagne glass, his gesture commanding immediate attention from every person in the reception area. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to join me in honoring a woman who exemplifies the very best of American military service," Marcus announced, his voice filled with genuine emotion and respect. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Admiral Mom, who protected this country with distinction, who raised an extraordinary daughter while serving in harm's way, and who demonstrated tonight that real honor cannot be bought, sold, or socially engineered." The military officers in attendance came to their feet immediately, their movement followed by the civilian guests, who recognized that they were witnessing something far more significant than a wedding reception toast. Even those who had no military background understood that they were in the presence of authentic honor and genuine sacrifice that made Victoria's social pretensions seem pathetic by comparison. "To Admiral Mom," Marcus said, raising his glass higher, "who taught me that leadership means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, that sacrifice is measured in service rather than social status, and that real respect is earned through character rather than connections." The toast was taken up by voices throughout the reception area, creating a chorus of recognition that transformed Sarah from marginalized ex-wife into honored veteran. Victoria remained seated, isolated in her shame and exposure, while Sarah stood surrounded by the genuine respect and gratitude that she had always deserved but had been denied for too long. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Jessica approached her mother with tears streaming down her face and 8 years of manipulated confusion finally clearing from her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm so sorry, I had no idea, I didn't understand." Sarah embraced her daughter, feeling the return of a relationship that Victoria had tried so hard to destroy. "You couldn't have known, sweetheart," she said softly. "But now you do. And now you understand why some things are worth fighting for." Marcus joined them, still wearing his dress uniform with every ribbon and commendation displayed with pride. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "thank you for everything you've taught me, and thank you for giving me the honor of marrying your daughter. I promise you that she'll never again be taught to apologize for the woman who raised her." The wedding that had begun with Sarah's exclusion and humiliation ended with her vindication and restoration to her rightful place in her daughter's life. Victoria's reign of manipulation was over, her social standing destroyed by the revelation of truths she had never imagined could surface. The Admiral Mom, who had been dismissed as unsophisticated, had proven that real power comes from integrity, service, and the kind of honor that cannot be inherited or purchased. As Sarah drove home through the San Diego night, she reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred in a single evening. The woman who had arrived at the hotel that morning as an unwelcome guest was leaving as a respected veteran who had reclaimed her daughter and exposed the corruption that had sought to diminish her. The title Admiral Mom would follow her for the rest of her life, a badge of honor that represented everything Victoria Thornton had tried and failed to destroy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.